Yes, hello to you all once again, and welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV as we go straight into another off-road classic and take a look at Jim Forrest's quite nice looking 1981 RM465 Suzuki. Now, it was back in the early 1980s when big was said to be beautiful, and as far as motocross bikes were concerned, the bigger the engine, the better in terms of its horsepower, because this was the age of the open class race bikes, and it seemed that every off-road bike manufacturer was in a constant battle with their competition to see who could make the baddest and most powerful motocross racing machine. Now, manufacturers like Yamaha, of course, had their YZ490, Honda had their 480R two-stroke bike, and Kawasaki had their completely awesome 500KX, and of course this bike here that we're looking at was Suzuki's RM465 twin-shocker from 1981. And so basically this early 1980s era was really all about who could build the fastest and biggest off-road bike to compete in what at that time was the 500cc World Motocross Championship. And for that year there were some pretty awesome motorcycles going around the racetracks of Europe, but of course with the power that these bikes were putting out, you had to recruit the toughest and best riders in the world to ride them. And to be fair, some of these big open class bikes were a bit of a handful, even for the most experienced of riders. And if you wanted to get onto the top step of the podium in the 1980s, when open class motocross bikes were the kings of the hill, you certainly needed a giant-sized pair of cojones to hold the throttle open in top gear on any of those 500cc monsters. Now, our featured 81 RM465 Suzuki belongs to Jim Forrest, and although Jim's Suzuki is not a fully original bike from that year, it's still a cracking example of one of these iconic Suzuki racers from a time when these bigger engined crossers were certainly up there with many of the other open class motocross motorcycles that Japan were exporting across the globe. So these 81 RM465s are basically a bored out RM400, but back in their day these 465s were maybe not the fastest bike among the open class racers, but that doesn't mean to say that this was a bad bike, because with the right rider in the seat of one of these RMs they could still attain very good results if the rider was prepared to work that light tubular steel chassis and of course that big two-stroke Suzuki power plant. And so as we take a look at the Suzuki motor, which is a 464 two-stroke reed valve induction engine with a 5-speed gearbox and a standard wet multi-plate clutch, which was actually housed inside a magnesium clutch cover. Now, as I remember, these engines had a bore of 86mm and a stroke of about 80mm, and the ignition on this engine was by way of Suzuki's PEI system, or pointless electronic ignition system, if you want to give it its full title. Now, air for the carburetor was fed through a twin air filter system, which had a flat foam filter fitted onto either side of the plastic airbox, which was very handy for replacement or servicing. But back in the day, riders did complain often about these filters not letting enough air into the carburetor and therefore restricting the motor's performance, of course. And it wasn't unusual to see riders leaving a section of the air filter cover open just to let in more air, while of course others took more drastic action and simply drilled holes into the filter cover to allow much more needed air into the motor, which actually did improve engine performance. Now again, back in 1981, it would have been probably a 38mm Mikuni carburetor that would have been fitted to this 465 Suzuki motor. Now I'm pretty sure that this is not the original part from that year, but it's certainly a Mikuni nevertheless. Now once more, for that particular year we had reed valve induction, which was one of the brand new technologies of its time, and our Suzuki here had an 8-petal reed valve block fitted to the motor, which was a great addition to those newer Suzuki motors, in that it did have a big improvement over the older piston port induction systems, whereby it helped to stop the motor from bogging down if you didn't have the revs right when you were maybe exiting a corner. Now once more, more weight saving on this Suzuki motor, as they did use a certain amount of magnesium in these engine casings manufacture, which naturally all kept the overall weight of the bike to a much more respectable level, which, as I remember, was around the 241 pounds mark when it had half a tank of fuel on board. But although the magnesium was lighter than maybe steel or alloy, it was of course much more expensive to produce and not as easy to repair if you had maybe a crack or a breakage. Now again, one of the other parts on Jim's 465 that's not original is this nice expansion chamber from D&G. But of course you can't expect a 43-year-old off-road motorcycle to still have all of its stock parts still bolted onto it, as these kind of exhaust systems do tend to take a lot of abuse on the track over the years, and there's only so many times that you can repair them before they then need replaced. And nowadays you just can't walk into your local Suzuki dealership and order a full exhaust system for an 81 465, so it's still good to have these modern day equivalents to fall back on. And as you can see again, this alloy tailpipe is another replacement item once again, and this looks like it's a DEP tailpipe from Derek Elwell Pipes here in the UK. Now up at the front end of our 465 we had a set of pretty basic 43mm forks, which for a bigger open class bike worked reasonably well, but they had very little in the way of adjustment to the damping or rebound. But of course, experimenting with different weights of fork oil or maybe harder or softer springs could certainly improve their performance. But in terms of their travel length, these usually gave the rider just over 11 inches of movement to play with. Now, magazine bike testers of these machines in 1981 did mention that these brakes on the 465 were among some of the best stoppers of their day for an off-road motocrosser, and although these alloy hubs with their straight pull spokes and added cooling fins were still old school braking systems, they did a decent job of pulling up this fiery 465 Suzuki. And once again, that front brake backplate was also manufactured in that precious magnesium compound. And so as we move on to the rear of our Suzuki, we had the single monoshock suspension, as of course the previous RM Suzuki models from 1980 were the last of the twin shock Suzukis, but these 81s did have an alloy bodied shock that had a linkage system at the top and at the bottom to coincide with Suzuki's full floater swing arm and suspension system, which again was quite radical, as other manufacturers at this time were still bolting their rear shocks directly onto the swing arm. But as I said, this full floater rear suspension on these 465s was revolutionary for its day, and to be fair, it all worked very well on the racetrack. Now, the combined gas and oil reservoir to feed that rear shock was mounted here just underneath the fuel tank, and it was placed in this position to try and put it out into the oncoming air, which hopefully, of course, would help keep it cool when that rear shock was worked hard. But by the time the 1980s came around, more or less all of the bodywork parts and these fuel tanks on motocross machines were all made from plastic, mainly because these were cheaper to produce than either alloy or steel, and you could, of course, have them in any colour that took your fancy. But these 465 fuel cells normally held about 2.5 gallons of pre-mixed fuel, which was usually enough to cover a full race moto from the 1980s. Now, as you'd expect, comfort was never really a factor on one of these open class bikes from this era, as of course most of the time you'd be standing up on the pegs anyhow, especially if you were riding on some of those very bumpy European racetracks of their day. But the seat on these 465s was still quite long, so there was plenty of scope to shift your weight from the front to the rear whenever it was required. But once again, I have to say that most of the plastics here on Jim's 465 Suzuki still look quite original and in decent condition for 43 years old. But of course, these parts could have been renovated or even restored at one time in the past, because there are now plenty companies out there who specialise in these kind of off-road plastic renovations. But these parts here still look good and period correct for their time. And so up at the business end of our 81 465 Suzuki, we have a modern set of rental handlebars and of course its associated crossbar pad as well. But again, these controls will more than likely be all replacements to the originals, as things like levers and cables, etc., all do tend to wear out over the years. Now, we also have an engine kill switch fitted here on this bike, which is never a bad thing to fit onto one of these open class racers should any emergency occur with that 465 motor. But these parts are also a legal requirement for racing classic bikes with the Scottish Classic Motorcycle Racing Club, who of course Jim races this bike with. And again, here we have this Ven Hill gasser throttle twist grip, just to try and help control the reputed 50 or so horses that are just dying to be let loose from that 465 reed valve motor. Although I have to say, for a bike that was basically only made from 1981 to 1982, these were still pretty awesome pieces of kit before Suzuki eventually replaced them with a fully blown 500 in 1983. But again, these are not very common bikes to see on vintage racetracks in this modern day now. Whether that's because there's not too many of them going around now, or maybe the availability of spare parts is a big factor. I'm not really sure. But despite the big 465 being up against machines like the YZ490 Yamaha and Honda's 482 stroke, and even the big 490 Maiko Mega 2, which was still a twin-shock racer at that time, these Suzukis still gave a good account of themselves, and they achieved some excellent results when some of the world's top riders raced them. And although, as I said, this example of Jim Forrest's here is maybe not a 100% authentic bike from that 81 era, it's still just great to take a look at one once again, and to remember and reminisce about a time when it was bikes like these 465 RM Suzukis and many others who ruled the racetracks of the big open class motocross revolution during the 1980s. Well, there you go. I hope you enjoyed that quick look at Jim Forrest's 81 RM465 Suzuki. But don't forget to join me once again very soon as we check out more vintage motocrossers right here on your favourite Classic Dirt Bike TV channel.